My son-in-law secretly took out a $75,000 loan in my name, and my own daughter helped him cover it up. They figured as a quiet old woman, I'd be too confused to notice. They started treating me like a child with fake concern and patronizing visits, all while they were spending my money on flashy gifts my daughter would then brag to me about. But they underestimated me. They had no idea my quiet little hobby and my church friends were about to become their worst nightmare, and I was about to serve them a lesson in humility they'd never forget, right in front of everyone they knew. There's a certain quiet satisfaction in a perfect pot roast. The kind that's been slow cooking all morning, filling the house with a smell that says home, more than any welcome mat ever could. That Sunday, I'd pulled out the good china, the plates with the little gold rims that my late husband Tom always said were too fancy for us. But with Melissa and Derek coming and with the baby on the way, it felt right to make things special. They arrived right on time, a gust of cold autumn air and forced cheerfulness blowing in with them. Melissa looked beautiful, her face rounder now, her hand resting instinctively on the curve of her belly. My heart did a little flip, the way it always did when I saw her. Derek followed her in, kissing the air near my cheek and handing me a bottle of wine I'd never drink. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, a man who seemed to be vibrating at a frequency too high for my quiet little corner of Kansas City. Dinner started pleasant enough. I asked about her latest doctor's appointment, and she told me the baby was kicking like a soccer player. Derek, though he couldn't sit still. His phone was on the table, face down, but it might as well have been a ticking clock. Every few minutes his eyes would dart towards it. He tried to cover his anxiety with big talk, telling us about some game-changing business deal he was on the verge of closing. He used a lot of words like leveraging assets and optimizing growth, words that felt slick and foreign in my dining room, like someone had spilled oil on a clean tablecloth. I asked him a simple question. Something about what his company actually did. He just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said it was all about providing for Melissa and the baby, about building a real future for them. Melissa beamed at him, squeezing his hand. She was so proud of his ambition, this drive, that seemed to me like a kind of hunger that could never be filled. He excused himself, then saying he had to take an urgent call. I watched him through the window as he paced on the back porch, his shoulders tight and his back rigid. He wasn't closing a deal. He looked more like a man waiting for a verdict. When he came back in, he was all smiles again, but the tension was still there, coiled just beneath the surface. To change the subject, I decided to show them my latest project. After clearing the plates, I brought out the quilt I'd been working on for the baby. It was a log cabin pattern, with soft yellows and greens, and a little bluebird I'd painstakingly embroidered in the center square. I spread it over the back of the sofa, the colors warm and gentle in the afternoon light. To me, it wasn't just a blanket. It was hours of love stitched right into the seams. It was a piece of our family history, something to be passed down. Derek glanced at it for a moment before turning back to his phone. He said it was a nice hobby, a good way for me to keep busy. The words weren't unkind, but they landed like little stones. A hobby. Like my skill, my heritage was just something to pass the time. I looked at Melissa, hoping she'd understand, but she just gave me a soft, placating smile. She said her husband was right, that I shouldn't be doing all this work. I should be relaxing, enjoying my retirement. Her voice was gentle, but the message was clear. My world of pot roasts and quilting was small and old-fashioned. Their world was the future, and it was fast and important. I just folded the quilt, the warmth of it suddenly gone, and put it away. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of polite conversation. They left just before sundown, promising to call soon. I waved from the porch as their new shiny car pulled away, feeling a familiar ache of loneliness settle in my chest. It wasn't just that they were gone. It was the feeling that a part of my daughter was gone too, replaced by someone I didn't quite recognize. The next few days were quiet. I tended to my mums in the garden, their bronze and purple heads a final burst of color before the winter gray. I went to my weekly church group, where we planned the upcoming potluck, and talked about our grandchildren. It was normal. It was life. On Wednesday, I walked down the driveway to get the mail, same as I do every day. There was the usual collection of catalogs and a letter from my cousin in St. Louis. And then there was another envelope. It was crisp white and important looking, with the logo of a big national bank I'd never done business with. I opened it right there at the mailbox, thinking it was just one of those pre-approved credit card offers. But it wasn't. It was a formal letter, a payment notice. My eyes scanned the page, trying to make sense of the words: loan account number, payment schedule, principal balance. Then I saw the number printed in bold, undeniable black ink, $75,000. And next to it, the borrower's name. My name. Rosa May Caldwell. For a long moment, I just stood there, the autumn wind rustling the dry leaves at my feet. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and a cold dread heavier than any winter storm began to settle deep in my bones. The due date for the first payment was in 2 weeks. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I walked back to the house in a daze, the letter clutched in my hand like a verdict. The paper felt cold sharp at the edges. Inside, the quiet of my home seemed to mock me. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, each one a little hammer blow against the silence. For a long time, I just sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd had that Sunday dinner, and stared at the letter. $75,000. It was a number so large it felt unreal, like something from a game show. But the dread coiling in my stomach was very real. My first instinct was a wave of pure, hot anger. But that passed quickly like a summer storm, and what was left behind was something colder, clearer, a kind of quiet resolve. I'd been a teacher for 40 years. I knew how to handle a problem. You don't start by shouting, you start by gathering the facts. I picked up the phone and dialed Melissa. I made my voice sound a little frail, a little confused. I told her I'd received some paperwork from the bank that I just couldn't make heads or tails of, and I was hoping she and Derek could pop over for a minute to help me understand it. She readily agreed, her voice full of that gentle, condescending care she'd adopted lately. She said they'd be right over, that I shouldn't worry my head about it. I hung up the phone and put on a kettle for coffee, my hands moving with a steady, deliberate calm that I didn't quite feel. When they arrived, I greeted them with a polite smile. I had the letter placed neatly on the kitchen table right next to the sugar bowl. Melissa came in and gave me a hug, telling me I probably just misplaced my glasses. Derek followed his smile as brittle as it had been on Sunday. He asked what the big emergency was, his tone trying for lighthearted but landing on impatient. I just gestured to the table and told them to have a seat, that I'd just poured the coffee. Melissa picked up the letter first, her brow furrowed in confusion. But Derek, he saw it from across the table, and it was like a switch had been flipped. All the color drained from his face. Before Melissa could even finish the first sentence, he started talking, the words tumbling out of him in a frantic defensive rush. He said it was just a short-term bridge loan, a standard business practice for a guaranteed investment he had lined up. He explained it was all for them, for Melissa and the baby, to secure their future. He never looked at me, not once. His eyes darted around the room, landing on everything but my face, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to bury the truth under a mountain of business jargon. His anger was a shield I could see, that plain as day. It was the frantic anger of a cornered animal. He asked why I was trying to ruin this, why I couldn't just trust him. He said I didn't understand how the modern world works. Melissa just looked back and forth between us, her face a mask of bewilderment. She kept trying to de-escalate, to find a simple explanation. She said there must be a misunderstanding, that Derek would never do anything to put me at risk. She wanted to believe him so badly you could see it in her eyes. She was pleading with me, with the universe, to make this not be what it looked like. I let him finish his frantic speech. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, thick and heavy. Then I looked directly at him, my gaze steady. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just said that if it was my name and my credit on the line, Derek, then I thought it was my business. I asked him to explain it to me. Simply. The quiet demand, the simple request to cut through the lies, did what shouting never could. It broke him. He just stood there, mouth open, with nothing left to say. The facade had cracked. They left in a storm of muttered excuses. Derek practically pulled Melissa out the door, her looking back at me with a confused, hurt expression. The front door clicked shut, and the house was quiet again. The adrenaline faded, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the situation. I was alone in this. My own daughter had looked at a clear-as-day lie and chosen to believe it because the truth was too painful. I sat there for a minute, feeling a profound sense of loss. Then I straightened my shoulders. I wasn't entirely alone. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was brisk, no nonsense, and the most comforting sound I'd heard all day. I said, "Carol, it's Rosa. I need your help. Someone took out a loan in my name." Carol's voice on the other end of the line was like a splash of cold water. Sharp, clear, and exactly what I needed. There was no pity, no coddling, just a brisk efficiency that had made her the best credit union manager in the county for 30 years. I explained the situation, and she listened without interruption, a skill I've come to appreciate more and more with age. When I finished, she didn't waste a second on outrage. Instead, she laid out a plan. She said my biggest advantage was that Derek thought I was a sweet, slightly confused old lady. Our job, she told me, was to make him believe it. I needed to feign compliance, to retreat, to make him so comfortable in his lie that he'd get sloppy. While he was basking in his supposed victory, we would gather the ammunition we needed. She told me exactly what to ask for at the bank, not just the loan agreement, but every single piece of paper associated with it, and most importantly, a formal request for the security footage from the day it was signed. The next time Melissa called, her voice thick with a worried, patronizing tone, I was ready. She asked if I was feeling better, if I was less confused. I played my part, letting out a sigh and telling her that all those numbers and business terms just went right over my head. I said that Derek was so smart, and I was sure he knew what was best for the family. I could almost hear the relief on the other end of the line. She told me I was right to trust him, that he was taking care of everything. Over the next week, they started treating me like a delicate piece of china. They'd bring me groceries I didn't need and call twice a day to check in. It was a gilded cage of their own making, and they thought they had me safely inside. What I couldn't see, what no one could, was the private hell Derek was living in. Late at night, long after Melissa was asleep, he would sit in his home office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating a face tight with shame. On the screen was a ghost, the web page of Apex Quantum Investments, now a dead link, a digital tombstone for their life savings. He remembered the webinar, the charismatic online guru with a perfect smile, who promised guaranteed returns, who made him feel savvy and powerful. He'd fallen for it completely, pouring in, not just his and Melissa's savings, but money he'd secretly pulled from his business line of credit. The moment of realization had come not in a dramatic phone call, but in a quiet, sickening lurch in his stomach, When the website simply wouldn't load one morning, it was all gone. Every last cent. The fraud against me wasn't a plan for profit. It was a desperate, panicked gasp for air from a man who was financially drowning and terrified of his wife seeing him as a failure. While he was sweating in his office, I was moving. Carol and I went to the bank on a quiet Tuesday morning. I felt a little tremor in my hands as we walked in, but Carol's presence was a steadying force. She did most of the talking, her voice calm and authoritative as she requested the documents. The bank manager, a young man who looked like he was barely out of college, was hesitant at first, but Carol's quiet confidence and knowledge of banking regulations left him no room to argue. We walked out with a promise that all the paperwork and a copy of the security footage would be ready for me in 48 hours. It was the first time since I'd opened that letter that I felt a flicker of my old self, of the woman who could manage a classroom of 30 unruly children. That Friday, just as I was getting ready to pick up the evidence from the bank, my phone rang. It was Melissa, her voice bubbling with excitement. She was gushing about a surprise Derek had just given her. He'd bought them the most extravagant high-tech baby stroller on the market, a machine that looked like it was ready for a moon landing. She said it was ridiculously expensive, but Derek had insisted. It was the first return from his big investment he'd told her, a sign of all the good things to come. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, and felt a cold fury settle over me. He wasn't just a liar and a thief. He was arrogant. He was using my money, my security, to buy frivolous toys, and then dangling them in front of my daughter as proof of his success. He didn't just think I was a confused old woman. He thought I was a fool. And that was a mistake he was going to regret. The phone call from the bank came on a Monday. 2 days later, I sat with Carol at my kitchen table, a thick manila envelope between us. The fury that had been simmering in me since Melissa's phone call had cooled into something harder, denser. It was the feeling of holding a heavy, weighted object, knowing you are about to use it. Carol, ever the professional, opened the envelope and laid out the contents with precision. There, it was a copy of the loan application. My signature, or rather a clumsy, almost childish forgery of it, was scrawled at the bottom. It was so poorly done, it was insulting. But the real blow came from the photographs. A series of high-resolution stills from the security camera, clear as day. There was Derek sitting across from a smiling loan officer. In one photo, he was laughing, leaning forward in his chair, radiating a confidence he didn't own. In the final one, he was shaking the officer's hand, a deal, sealed with my name, my credit, my life's work. Seeing it all laid out in black and white solidified everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated betrayal. The plan was set. I called Melissa that afternoon, keeping my voice light and casual. I told her I'd made a lemon meringue pie her favorite, and asked if she and Derek wanted to come over for a slice after dinner. She agreed immediately, her voice still full of that bright, oblivious cheer. The trap was laid with her favorite dessert. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. They arrived around 7, Derek still wearing the armor of his false success. He talked about his work, about the new stroller, about the bright future ahead. Melissa was glowing, her hand resting on her stomach, completely unaware that her world was about to be torn apart. I served the pie and poured the coffee, my hands steady. Every polite question I asked, every smile I offered felt like a lie. We were all playing our parts in a terrible little play, and the curtain was about to fall. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. I feigned surprise as I opened it to find Carol, who apologized for dropping by unannounced, saying she was just in the neighborhood. I invited her in for a slice of pie, and the stage was finally set. We made small talk for a few minutes, the air in my kitchen growing thicker with every tick of the clock. Then, as she finished her coffee, Carol reached into her large purse and pulled out the manila envelope. She placed it on the table and looked at me. She said, Well, the bank was very cooperative. It happened just as we'd planned. She laid out the documents one by one, the application with the forged signature, and then the photos. She slid them across the table so they stopped right in front of Derek. His face went ashen. The confident, successful man from the photograph vanished, replaced by a pale, terrified stranger. All the bluster, all the arrogant energy just evaporated into thin air. He stared at the picture of himself smiling, his mouth hanging slightly open. He tried to speak, stammering something about a misunderstanding about context, but the words were empty, hollow things. The visual proof was absolute, and it had struck him dumb. Melissa looked from the photos to her husband's crumbling face, her own expression a slow-motion collapse from confusion to pure horror. Her voice was a whisper when she asked him what this was. That was all it took. Cornered, broken, and with nowhere left to hide the truth, finally spilled out of him. It wasn't a neat confession. It was a pathetic, desperate collapse. The words came out in a torrent of shame and fear. He told her everything, not just about the loan, but about the scam, the lost savings, the business debt. He confessed that the confident provider she admired was a fraud, a failure who had lost everything and was terrified of her finding out. He sobbed that he had just been trying to fix it, that he couldn't bear the thought of her thinking he was a failure. He wasn't a villain delivering a monologue. He was a broken man crushed under the weight of his own deceit, and it was a pitiful sight to behold. My daughter just stared at him, her face wet with silent tears. I could see the war in her eyes. The devastation of the betrayal was there, but so was something else, a deep, aching pity for the terrified, sobbing man her husband had become. She had been betrayed, but the man who betrayed her was in more pain than she could have imagined. In that moment, with Derek weeping and Melissa paralyzed by shock, the power in the room shifted. It flowed away from his frantic lies and settled calm and heavy with me. I stood up and collected the papers from the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at them both, my voice even and quiet, cutting through the sound of Derek's sobs. I told them that the lies stop now. I informed them that the bank had been notified of the fraud, but that was just the beginning. I said that how we handle this as a family and in our community was what we would decide next, and I would be the one to decide. In the quiet days that followed the storm in my kitchen, a heavy silence settled over our family. I let it be. Sometimes the most important work happens in the quiet, when the truth has nowhere to hide. Derek and Melissa were in a self-imposed exile, waiting for my judgment. I knew they expected a lawyer's letter, a lawsuit, a declaration of war. But that was never my way. Justice. I've always believed shouldn't just be about punishment. It should be about mending what was broken. And what was broken here was more than just my bank account. It was trust. It was community. My plan for justice wouldn't take place in a courtroom. It would happen in the one place that served as the true heart of our community, the fellowship hall of our church. The annual potluck supper was that Sunday. I met with Pastor Mike and two of the church elders, both men I had known for over 40 years, on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't bring the photographs or the forged documents. I simply told them the truth, framing it as a story of a family in crisis. I spoke of desperation, born from shame of a terrible mistake made by a young man terrified of failure. I didn't ask for punishment. I asked for guidance. I asked for the community to help us heal. When Sunday evening arrived, the fellowship hall was buzzing with life. The air was thick with the comforting smells of baked ham, scalloped potatoes, and a dozen different casseroles. People laughed and shared stories, their voices a warm, familiar hum. I had insisted that Derek and Melissa attend. They arrived late, slipping into the hall like ghosts. Derek was a hollowed-out version of himself, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Melissa looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, her hand never leaving her belly, as if to shield her unborn child from the shame that clung to them both. They sat at a small table in the corner, and a little circle of silence seemed to form around them. After the meal, as people were getting their coffee and dessert, Pastor Mike stood up at the front of the hall. He was a kind man with a gentle voice that could still command a room. He didn't look at Derek. He looked out at all of us, his congregation, his flock. He began to speak, not about sin in the abstract, but about the very modern plagues of pride and fear. He talked about the shiny promises of the internet of schemes that prey on our desire to provide for our families, and how easily shame can lead a good person down a dark path. He said that bearing false witness wasn't just about telling a lie, but about living one. Then he announced that in light of these new challenges, the church would be starting a financial literacy seminar for all ages, a way to help protect our community from the wolves at the door. He said he was so grateful that I, with my 40 years of teaching experience, and Carol, with her 30 years of banking wisdom, had agreed to lead it. A ripple of applause went through the room, and then came the final quiet blow. The pastor said that our community is a safety net, and sometimes a member of our own family falls. He announced that the church would be taking up a special anonymous collection to help a family amongst us who had made a grave error and was now in need of grace and guidance to make restitution. He never said a name. He didn't have to. In the quiet that followed, you could feel the subtle shift of 100 gazes, all moving towards the corner table. It wasn't a stare of condemnation. It was a look of deep, compassionate sorrow. The weight of that collective gaze, of that quiet public judgment, was more powerful than any verdict a judge could deliver. It was too much for Derek. He stood up his chair, scraping against the linoleum floor. Tears were streaming down his face, and his body shook with sobs he couldn't contain. In a choked voice that was barely a whisper, but seemed to fill the entire hall, he looked at the pastor and confessed that he was the one that the pastor was talking about him and that he needed help. That was it. That was his rock bottom. The public admission, the complete surrender of his pride, was the ultimate humiliation. But it was also the first honest thing he had done in a very long time. Later, as the evening was winding down, it was time for the annual quilt raffle. The grand prize was my log cabin quilt, the one I had shown them that first Sunday. When my name was called as the creator, I walked to the front, took the microphone, and called my daughter's name. Melissa looked up, her face a mess of confusion and tears. She walked slowly to the front, and I folded the quilt and placed it in her arms. I leaned in close so only she could hear me. I told her this was the truth-stitched quilt. Every patch, I said, is a piece of the truth. It's not always pretty, but it's strong, and it can keep a family warm if you're willing to mend it right. She just clutched it to her chest and sobbed, a sound of both heartbreak and, for the first time in a long time, a flicker of hope. The aftermath of the potluck wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. In our town, consequences don't always shout. Sometimes they just settle over you like a fine layer of dust. For Derek, the shame was a heavy cloak he had to wear everywhere. There was no escaping it. He started working a second job stocking shelves at the grocery store late at night, a humbling come-down for a man who had talked so much about leveraging assets. At church, some people would give him a wide berth, their silence a judgment of its own. Others, the truly kind ones, would offer a quiet nod, a gesture that spoke of grace but demanded repentance. It wasn't an easy path, and I know there were days he wanted to quit. He and Melissa started counseling with Pastor Mike, a weekly appointment that was, I imagine, like slowly setting a broken bone. Melissa began visiting me on her own. At first, our conversations were stilted, full of unspoken apologies. But slowly, a new kind of honesty began to grow between us. She admitted she had been so dazzled by Derek's ambition that she had become blind to his desperation. She saw how she had mistaken his grand gestures for strength and my quiet practicality for weakness. She started asking me about the quilt, about the different patterns, and the stories behind the scraps of fabric I used. She was no longer just my daughter. She was becoming a woman who understood that strength isn't always loud, and that the most valuable things are often built slowly, stitch by stitch. Our relationship was being rebuilt, not on the old fragile ground of family obligation, but on a new solid foundation of mutual respect. As for me, I found a new purpose. The financial literacy workshop that Carol and I started became my passion. We held it every other Tuesday in the church basement. At first, only a few seniors showed up, but word spread. Soon, we had young couples, single parents, people from all walks of life, all wanting to learn how to protect themselves. I took the most painful experience of my life and turned it into a shield for others. I wasn't just Rosa Caldwell, the retired teacher, anymore. I was a woman who had faced betrayal and found a way to stitch something new and useful from the scraps. 6 months passed. The world turned from the crisp gold of autumn to the deep freeze of winter, and then thawed into the gentle green of spring. And with the spring came my granddaughter, a tiny, perfect little thing named Hope. One sunny afternoon, Melissa was over the baby asleep in a bassinet beside us. We were sitting on the porch, and I was showing Melissa how to add a new patch to the truth-stitched quilt, a bright square of sunny yellow fabric from one of her old baby dresses. Her hands, so used to a smartphone, were clumsy with the needle at first, but she was patient, determined. Just as the sun began to dip below the trees, Derek's old car pulled into the driveway. He got out looking tired from his second job, but the frantic, haunted look was gone from his eyes. He looked clear. He walked up the porch steps and stopped in front of me. He didn't make excuses or offer a grand apology. He just quietly handed me an envelope with the monthly repayment inside. He looked me in the eye and said thank you. It was a simple phrase, but it held the weight of everything that had happened. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, and a promise, all in 2 words. I just nodded. He then went over to Melissa, kissed her softly, and gently lifted his sleeping daughter from the bassinet. He held her to his chest, his large hands looking so gentle against her tiny form. The 3 of them stood there on my porch, bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. It wasn't a perfect happy ending. The scars were still there, but it was real. It was a new beginning, a quiet, sober reality, being built not on lies or ambition, but on the humble, difficult, and beautiful thread of truth. In the end, it wasn't a simple story of revenge, but a lesson in the complex art of mending. A family torn apart by a lie, born from shame and fear, found its way back, not through vengeance, but through a quiet communal justice. The truth, like a needle and thread, can be sharp and painful. But in the hands of someone with wisdom and grace, it doesn't just expose the wound, it stitches it closed, creating something stronger, if not more scarred, than what was there before. True victory wasn't breaking him, but rebuilding them.